Ever get the feeling like, man, people are just like judging each other constantly these days? It's everywhere you look.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And it kind of makes you want to like take a step back and say, hold on a sec. Are we really being fair here? You know? And I think that's why we wanted to take a deep dive into this whole idea of judging others.
Happens to the best of us, right? We zero in on others' flaws, no problem.
Like it's an Olympic sport.
Exactly. But what about our own slip-ups? This passage, Matthew chapter 7 from the Sermon on the Mount, really dives into this whole judging thing. And I think, you get right into it too. It's like, bam,
Yeah.
do not judge or you too will be judged. How does that, is it really saying you can't even have an opinion about what somebody else is doing?
Well, it's interesting because I think that's kind of the natural question that comes up.
Right.
When you read these verses, it's like, oh, so I can't have any judgment about whether something's right or wrong.
Right.
But I think what Jesus is getting at here is not so much that we never make judgments.
Yeah.
It's about how we're approaching that judgment. Like, what is the posture of our hearts when we're looking at someone else?
Okay, so it's more about our motivation for making that judgment.
I think so.
And that's, I think, really what the next part is about, right?
Yeah.
This whole speck of sawdust in someone else's eye compared to the plank in our own eye.
Yeah. The plank and the speck.
So, like, beyond just saying, don't be a hypocrite, what's the deeper message here?
It's about self-awareness, or the lack thereof. See, it's way easier to point out flaws in others than to acknowledge our own, right? Our ego's like a suit of armor.
Right.
This passage, though, it's like it's telling us to take off that armor, turn inward. That's where real growth happens. And so I think that's what Jesus is getting at here. It's like, hey, let's have some introspection here. Let's look at our own lives first.
So how do you do that then?
Well, I think it starts with just like pausing
Okay.
before you offer criticism or judgment to someone else and just asking yourself, okay, am I really in a place to be saying this? Am I guilty of the same thing, even if it looks a little bit different?
Yeah.
And then that gives you an opportunity to maybe show some grace
Right.
to that other person. And sometimes you might realize that you're not.
Yeah.
But then the question is this something that is really going to be helpful for me to point out?
Right.
Or am I just doing this to make myself feel better? So I think that's a really important question to ask ourselves.
Well, and I feel like that's where you get to the part about the dogs and pigs, which I always found to be kind of a jarring image.
Yeah. And it's not just about holding back on criticism, but also knowing when to just let things be.
Whoa. So sometimes saying nothing is actually wiser. You're blowing my mind here.
Well, look at how it's worded, right?
Mm.
Don't give what is sacred to dogs or throw your pearls before swine. Sounds kind of harsh, but I think what Jesus is getting at there is that there are some people who are just not ready to hear what you have to say.
Yeah.
And if you try to force it on them, it's gonna make things worse.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in knowing when to speak and when to just kind of let it go.
Yeah, and with whom to share certain things.
Exactly.
This has been really interesting.
Yeah, I think we could all use a little bit more humility.
That's really the takeaway here. So for all of our listeners out there, what planks might you need to work on before you point out the specks in other people? Definitely something to think about.
Keep diving deep, everybody.